There is a kind of pain that doesn't scream. It doesn't slam doors. It doesn't throw plates. It doesn't even always cry. Sometimes it just stares at a screen that never lights up. Sometimes it replays the last conversation 100 times, looking for the exact word that made them colder, quieter, harder to reach. Sometimes it lies awake at 2:13 in the morning, trying to understand how someone who once looked at you like you mattered can suddenly act like your presence is too heavy to hold. And that pain is especially brutal when the person pulling away is avoidant. Because they don't always leave with cruelty. They leave with confusion, with mixed signals, with almost love, with warmth one day and distance the next, with just enough tenderness to make you think, maybe if I say it better, maybe if I love them softer, maybe if I stop asking for so much, they'll come back. But here is the truth that changes everything. The more you chase an avoidant for reassurance, the less they respect your presence. Not because you are too much, not because you are needy, not because your love is wrong, but because anxious pursuit, especially when it comes from fear, teaches them that no matter how little they give, you will still overextend to keep the connection alive. And once that pattern is set, they stop feeling your value. They only feel your availability. That is the brutal truth. You are not being measured by how deeply you love. You are being measured by what your nervous system allows. That's why this hurts so much. Because you thought love would make them feel safe enough to stay, when in reality, overgiving often makes an avoidant feel cornered, pressured, flooded, watched, responsible for emotions they don't know how to regulate. So they do what their body has been trained to do. They retreat. Not always because they stopped caring, but because caring started to feel like drowning. That's the part almost nobody tells you. Avoidant attachment is not coldness at its core. It is overwhelm wearing the mask of detachment. It is a nervous system that learned long ago that closeness can become engulfment, that being needed can become losing yourself, that emotional intensity can feel less like love and more like danger. So when intimacy rises, their body often reacts before their mind can explain it. The amygdala senses threat. Cortisol begins to rise. Their chest tightens. Their thoughts get foggy. Their desire for space becomes urgent, almost primal. And then dopamine does something cruel. Distance starts to feel relieving. Not because distance is what they truly want, but because relief is addictive. That is why avoidants can miss you and still ignore you, think about you and still not text, love your presence and still feel the need to escape it. Their silence is often not the absence of feeling, it is the overflow of unprocessed feeling. And if you do not understand this, you will personalize everything. You will think, if they cared, they would act like it. If I mattered, they would be clear. If I were enough, they wouldn't need so much distance. But avoidants do not deactivate because you are worthless. They deactivate because closeness activates things inside them they do not know how to carry. And this is where your power either collapses or returns. Because if you respond to their withdrawal by begging harder, explaining longer, proving more, waiting with your heart in your hands, you accidentally become part of the pattern that lets them avoid growth. You become the cushion between them and the consequences of emotional inconsistency. You become the person who keeps showing up so they never have to feel your absence. And people rarely respect what they never have to risk losing. Read that again in your bones. People rarely respect what they never have to risk losing. So if you want an avoidant to respect you more, deeply, viscerally, unmistakably, you have to stop trying to manage their emotions with your self-abandonment. You have to learn one core thing. Clean silence. Not punishment. Not manipulation. Not fake indifference. Clean silence. The kind that comes from emotional self-possession. The kind that says, I will not beg for what should move freely toward me. The kind that says, I can feel this loss without making a performance out of my pain. The kind that says, your confusion is not my command. Clean silence is terrifying when you first enter it, because it feels like doing nothing when every cell in your body wants to reach out. Your nervous system will panic. Dopamine withdrawal will hit. You will crave one more message, one more explanation, one more tiny proof that you still exist in their mind. That craving is real. It is chemical. The attachment bond is not just emotional poetry, it is biology. Your brain got used to the cycle: hope, contact, delay, relief, confusion, pursuit. And intermittent reinforcement is one of the strongest addictions the human nervous system can form. That's why the person who gives you the least clarity can occupy the most space in your mind. Your brain becomes obsessed with resolution. But obsession is not connection. And urgency is not love. So when the avoidant pulls away, and instead of chasing, you go quiet. Not icy, not cruel, just grounded. Something changes. At first, they may feel relief. That part matters. Do not romanticize the beginning of your silence. At first, they may think, finally, space. Finally, no pressure. Finally, no emotional confrontation. And if you panic at this stage, you will break your own power. Because the first few moments of your absence are not the truth of your impact. They are just the release valve of their overstimulated system. But then something deeper begins. The noise stops. Your check-ins stop. Your emotional labor stops. Your reassurance stops. The easy access stops. And for the first time, they are left alone with the one thing they spend most of their life outrunning: their own inner world. That is when respect begins to grow. Not because they enjoy losing you, but because your silence is no longer feeding the illusion that they can neglect the connection without consequence. Now they have to feel. Now they have to wonder. Now they have to confront the empty space where your energy used to be. And this is where the power dynamic flips. Because when you chase, they do not have to process your value. They only have to manage your pursuit. But when you become still, they begin to experience you differently. Now you are not the one waiting. They are the one listening for a notification. Now you are not the one over-explaining. They are the one replaying your last words. Now you are not the one afraid of being forgotten. They are the one discovering how loud your absence can become. And yes, avoidants notice absence. More than they admit. More than they show. More than your pain has allowed you to believe. They notice when the person who always reached no longer reaches. They notice when warmth is no longer instantly available. They notice when the emotional supply they quietly depended on is gone. Because even distant people get attached to who regulates them. They may not say it, they may not know how to say it, but they feel it. Picture this. They pick up their phone at night, almost by reflex. Some part of them expects your name to be there, because it usually is. A check-in, a soft question, a bridge back into connection that you always built for them. But this time, There is nothing. They put the phone down. A small thing. Except it isn't small. Because now the mind starts doing what silence forces it to do. It fills in the space. Are you angry? Are you done? Did you finally see them clearly? Did they wait too long? Are you moving on? Are you becoming someone they can no longer access so easily? And underneath those thoughts, something even more destabilizing begins to rise. What if you were more important than they let themselves admit? Avoidants often suppress longing until longing becomes loss. They can mute emotion while the connection is available, but once it becomes uncertain, the nervous system shifts. The distance that once felt like relief starts turning into deprivation. That is when memory sharpens. Now they remember your voice, your steadiness, the way you saw through them without humiliating them, the way your presence softened rooms they didn't even know were tense inside them. Now your absence becomes emotionally expensive. That is respect. Not empty compliments, not breadcrumbs, not a late night, "Hey stranger," sent from boredom. Real respect begins when your energy is no longer assumed. But let's go deeper, because this is where most people sabotage themselves. The moment the avoidant circles back, even subtly, you feel hope explode inside you. A like on a story, a random text, a tiny opening, a half-hearted check-in. And because you've been starving, crumbs start to feel like a feast. This is the danger. If you break your pattern too early, if you melt the second they return, if you reward minimal effort with maximum access, you teach them that your boundaries are temporary emotions, not permanent standards. And then nothing changes. They do not respect you more. They simply learn your reset button. That's why silence alone is not enough. Silence without self-worth is just suppressed yearning. Silence with standards becomes transformation. When they return, your energy has to be different, slower, cleaner, less available to confusion. No rushed intimacy, no over-explaining, no emotional essays. No pretending the past didn't happen just because they reopened the door a little. This is where many people lose themselves, because they want relief more than truth. But relief is what kept you trapped. You do not need another temporary high. You need a new internal identity. You need to become someone who no longer confuses longing with alignment. Someone who can say, "Yes, I feel you missing me, but that is not enough. Yes, I can sense your pull, but I need consistency, not chemistry. Yes, I still care, but I no longer offer myself where I have to shrink to be held." That energy changes everything. Because avoidants may run from pressure, but they deeply register emotional solidity. They may resist demands, but they notice standards. They may pull away from intensity, but they are haunted by grounded people who do not collapse when love becomes uncertain. That kind of person is rare. That kind of person cannot be played with casually. That kind of person earns respect because they are not operating from hunger. They are operating from self-trust. And self-trust is magnetic. It is magnetic because it does not chase. It does not plead for clarity that should be volunteered. It does not abandon itself to maintain access. It stays rooted, even while the heart is shaking, especially while the heart is shaking. Let's be honest, part of you still wants the fantasy, the moment where they finally realize your worth, come rushing back, confess everything, and choose you with certainty. Maybe that happens. Maybe it doesn't. But if your healing depends on that scene, you are still in their orbit. And the entire point of this shift is to leave the orbit. The real win is not making them text first. It is becoming someone whose peace is no longer held hostage by another person's avoidance. Because once you reach that place, something strange happens. You stop performing for their approval. You stop scanning for tiny changes in tone. You stop interpreting silence as a verdict on your worth. You stop bargaining with reality. And that is when your power becomes undeniable. Not because you became colder, but because you became congruent. Your outside finally matches what your soul has been begging you to realize. I am not hard to love. I am just no longer available for emotionally expensive half-love. That identity shift is what avoidants feel. They can feel when you still need them to validate you, and they can feel when you don't. When you still need them, they unconsciously hold the upper hand, not because they are stronger, but because your fear gives them leverage. When you no longer need them to tell you who you are, the dynamic changes instantly. Now they cannot control the connection through withdrawal. Now your value does not drop just because their attention does. Now they are dealing with someone who will not chase the version of them that only shows up in fragments. And fragments no longer impress you. Let them feel that. Let them feel what it is like to meet someone they cannot keep in limbo. Let them feel what it is like when their usual strategy stops working, when distance no longer guarantees your pursuit, when ambiguity no longer buys them time, when your silence is not a game, but a mirror that says, this is what your inconsistency costs. Because sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is stop cushioning people from the emotional consequences of how they handle you. Not to punish them, but to honor yourself. There is a difference. Punishment says, I want you to hurt like I hurt. Self-respect says, I refuse to keep hurting myself so you can stay comfortable. That is the line. Do not cross back over it. Because once an avoidant begins to feel your absence, they may come close again. They may soften. They may open. They may even seem transformed. But patterns are strongest right before they break. And sometimes, right before they break, they try one last time to repeat themselves. One last delay. One last mixed signal. One last half-step toward you without real emotional responsibility. That moment is the test, not of whether they love you, of whether you love yourself enough to not re-enter the cycle unchanged. So if they come back, do not just listen to their words. Watch their capacity. Can they stay present when emotion enters the room? Can they communicate before disappearing? Can they tolerate closeness without punishing you for needing connection? Can they meet you in reality, not just in moments of loneliness? That is what matters. Because missing you is easy. Respecting you requires behavior. And behavior is where truth lives. You do not need to become unreachable. You do not need to become hard. You do not need to become some detached, glittering version of a person who never cared. That is not power. Real power is softer than that. cleaner than that. It is the ability to care deeply without abandoning yourself deeply. It is the ability to love without kneeling, to desire without begging, to remain open without becoming available to chaos. That is what changes the story. Because the moment you stop saying, "How do I get them to choose me?" and start saying, "I choose myself too strongly to accept less than mutual effort," something ancient inside you begins to unclench. The waiting ends. The bargaining ends. The self-betrayal ends. And in that space, your energy becomes almost unrecognizable. Calm, sharp, whole. You stop looking like someone trying to be kept. You start looking like someone whose presence is a privilege. That is when avoidants respect you more. Not because you begged the right way, not because you cracked some secret code, not because you learned how to become less emotional, less human, less needy, but because you stopped handing them intimate access to a version of you that was terrified of being left. You met that terrified part. You held it. You stopped making it run the relationship. And now, whether they return or not, you are no longer standing in the same place. Now you understand something most people learn far too late. The deepest form of attraction is not emotional intensity. It is emotional self-possession. It is the quiet force of a person who knows their heart is valuable and acts like it. So if you are in that painful silence right now, if you are staring at the phone, replaying the last shift in their voice, wondering if disappearing would make them realize what they lost, hear this carefully. Do not disappear to provoke them. Rise to free yourself. Let your silence come from dignity, not strategy. Let your distance come from alignment, not revenge. Let your absence become the space where your self-worth finally grows roots. And if that forces them to feel you more, good. If that makes them miss you, good. If that wakes up their respect, good. But none of that is the real miracle. The real miracle is this. You finally stop treating your softness like something that has to beg to be chosen. You finally stop shrinking your needs into something easier to ignore. You finally stop calling unstable love potential. And you become the kind of person who can be loved properly because you are no longer available for anything less. That is the shift. That is the rule they can feel, the one they don't expect, the one that changes the entire dynamic. You were never powerless. You were just over-invested in someone else's emotional pace. Now you return to your own. Now your nervous system is no longer kneeling at the altar of inconsistency. Now your peace is your power. Your standards are your protection. Your silence is your self-respect. And your worth is no longer up for negotiation. Let them feel the difference. More importantly, let you feel it. Because once you do, you will never again confuse being deeply affected with being deeply chosen. And that changes everything.